Welcome back to Building Games on AWS. My name is Zach, and in this episode, we're going to finish setting up our backend and set up authentication with Amazon Cognito and API Gateway. So the first thing we're going to do is go into the Amazon Cognito console. So I'll open that up here. We're going to be creating a user pool that we're going to use for users to be able to register and log in. So let's go to Manage User Pools and then create a user pool. I will put a name here. There's a lot we can configure with Cognito, but we're going to stick with pretty much default settings here. So I'm going to go ahead, use defaults, and create pool. As you can see here, with some of those defaults, we're only requiring an email on the registration form, so you'll just need a username, an email, and a password. And then we do have a minimum password strength policy here that we'll have to comply with. What we will need to do next here is go to App Clients, and we're going to be creating an app client for our login function. So when users request to log in, that's going to go to our API Gateway backend, and then a Lambda function is going to be running the actual logic to connect to Cognito. So let's create that app client by clicking on Add an App Client. I will just call this Lambda Login Client. I'm going to leave these expirations as default, but I'm going to uncheck Generate Client Secret. Now there's a number of different auth flows we can use with Cognito. For this app client, it's just going to be used by our Lambda function, and we're going to just be using the user password auth flow. So I'm going to uncheck SRP and custom auth, and going to select our user password auth. With that, I will create the app client. Now we want to set up the Cognito hosted UI. This is going to give us a registration and login form that we can use to create some initial users. So to do that, I'm going to go to App Client Settings, and we're going to set this up for the hosted UI here. So I'm going to use Cognito User Pool for the identity provider. For these URLs, these are going to be the redirect URLs for a successful login, that's the callback URL, and for a sign out, that's the sign out URL. We do have these as required parameters, but we don't have a game web page, so I'm just going to use the AWS homepage. For the auth flows, I'm going to do an implicit grant for the email and OpenID scope. We'll save changes there. Now there's one last thing we'll have to do before that hosted UI becomes available. We're going to have to choose a domain name. So in this next tab below here, we can click on domain name. You can see we have two options. One for just using a subdomain on amazoncognito.com, or you can also use your own domain. For the sake of simplicity here, we're just going to use the subdomain here. We will need a unique subdomain. You can check that that's available, and it is. So I'll save the changes there. Now if we go back to App Client Settings, we can scroll down here and we can see there's now an option to launch that hosted UI. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. Now we can see we have this UI where we can sign in and register users. If this doesn't show up immediately, you may need to wait a couple minutes for the subdomain to create. We don't have any users yet to sign in, so we're going to have to go to the sign up form. So here you'll need an email address that you can verify, and then I'm just going to create a user here. And we're ready to sign up. As you can see here, we'll just have to verify our email. And once we do that, we can confirm the account. As you can see here, we've just redirected to our callback URL, which was, in this case, the AWS homepage. And you can see we also have that token generated from the login. I'm going to go ahead and just close this tab though. So we can go to the users and groups tabs here, and if we click on this refresh icon, we should see the user we just created, test user. We can see that the email is verified. We're just going to be creating one user to test with right now, so we're actually done now creating the user pool. The next step, we're going to go to the Lambda console. I'm going to open that up in a new tab because we are going to want to refer back to our app client ID here in a moment. So once you're in the Lambda console, we're going to create function, and we're going to author from scratch, and our runtime is going to be Python 3.8. The name here is going to be for our Cognito login function. So we'll call it that. And create function. Now we have sample code for this login function. I'm going to be copying that from our GitHub repository. The link here should be in the description below. The code we're going to be looking at is going to be in this Lambda folder. And we've got this cognito login.py. You can see there's also another file, this JSON file, which has some permissions we're going to need to use as well in a moment. But to start, I'm going to open this file up. We're going to copy this code here. And back to our Lambda function. We now have our code open here, so we can paste our Lambda code there. So there's one thing we'll have to change in this code. We're going to have to put our user pool app client ID. This is the ID we just created in Cognito on this app clients tab. I'm going to choose this app client ID here. And this will allow our Lambda function to use this app client with that auth flow. Paste that there. So let's just go over what this code is doing real quick. This Lambda handler is what's being called when the Lambda is triggered. We're expecting a username and password object to be passed, so we're checking that that exists, and then we're running this initiate auth function. From here, we're just calling this client, which is our Cognito Bodo 3 client, to make the API call initiate auth. For the parameters we're passing there, you can see we have a specified auth flow. That's the user password auth, which is what we selected in our app client previously. So if you failed to change the correct auth flow here, we will have a failure when testing this, but we've ensured that we've selected the right auth flow for what we're actually using here. Then we're of course passing the username and password. So I'm going to just go ahead and deploy to save the code changes we've made. Before we can run this, we will need to add permissions so that this function is able to run this initiate auth function. So I'm going to go to the configuration tab. In this permissions tab on the side here, we have an execution role. So I'm going to click on this role name, and that will open up our IAM console where we can add some permissions. I'm going to add an inline policy and move over to the JSON editor. Now, going back to our GitHub repository, I'm going to go back to our Lambda folder, and we have that JSON file. If we open that up, this is the IAM policy we're going to want to add. So I'll just paste that there. As you can see, all this is doing is allowing the action initiate auth. I'll review policy, give it a name here. And create. So now that we've done that, we're going to want to test out our Lambda function. So let's just go to code over here. We've already got it deployed, but we have this test button here. We'll need to click on the drop down there and configure a test event first. So this will be the JSON object that goes into the Lambda handler. So let's configure. We'll be creating a new test event. We can just use this template. We'll call this login success, where we'll try to connect with our correct username and password. So this will be username, password. We've got test user, and then I'll put in my password here. I'll click create. Now I'll just make a second test event for a failure. So we'll create new test event. We'll just use this last one we made as a template. Login fail, and here I'll just change the password and create. So I'm going to test on the fail first. Let's test. And you can see here we have what we're looking for, a status of fail, and the message is username or password is incorrect. So that looks good. Now let's test the success. So we'll change our test event to that one, and then click test again. As you can see here, we've got a success and we've got a tokens object, so we can use this token information to now make authenticated requests with Cognito. So we are done with this Lambda function now. Last thing we're going to do is create the API gateway, which is going to wrap this all together. So let's go to the API gateway console. And we're going to be building a REST API. So I'm going to go ahead and click build here. I'm going to ignore the example API. If this is the first time you've created an API gateway, that might show. I'm just going to click on new API, and we'll give it a name here. And we will create. So we're going to be defining two resources and methods here. The first is going to be our login function, which is going to connect to our Cognito login Lambda that we just made. And the other is going to be for starting a session, and that's going to connect to the Lambda function that we made with Dylan in the last episode. So I'm going to go to actions here and click create resource. So this is going to be login, and that will be at the login resource path, and create. Now we'll click actions again and create method. This is going to be a post method, since we're posting username and password, and we'll check that. Now we can select Lambda function as our integration type, and we can type in our Lambda function name for a drop-down to show up. As we can see, we have our Cognito login function. We'll select that and save. This is also going to automatically add API gateway permission to invoke that Lambda. So we'll just click OK there. Now, clicking back at this root, we're going to create a second resource. So actions, create resource, and then this is going to be start session, and create. We'll create a method on start session, and that's going to be a get function. This is going to be Lambda again for the integration type, and we're going to pick the Lambda function we made in the last episode. So that will be the start game session function, and save. So now that we've created those, we're going to set up our authorizer for Cognito. So in this tab on the side for authorizers, we have an option here to create a new authorizer. As you can see, we already have integration built in for Cognito, so we can just select this button here, and we now have a drop-down where we can select our user pool that we just created. We will need to specify a token source. This is going to be the header on the request that has the token in it. So this is going to be authorization. And we'll need to create a name for this. And create. Now it may take a few seconds for this authorizer to create before we can use it in the next step. So I'm just going to refresh the page, click on resources, and now we can specify where we want that authorizer to be used. So for the login function, this is going to be for users who aren't yet logged in, of course, so we don't want to require the authorizer there. For the start session function, though, we do want this to be only logged in users. So we're going to set up the authorizer here. So to do that, we're going to click on this get method, and you should see this section show up. We're going to click on method request. And in the settings, we have an authorization section. It's currently set to none, but we can click this edit button. And we should now see the authorizer we just created in the drop-down. So I'll select that. Again, if this doesn't show up, just refresh the page because it does take a refresh for that authorizer to show up. So I'll click the check to update that. And we now have authorization with Cognito set up for that function. The only thing we'll have to do here on the API gateway is just deploy it now. So we can do that from this Actions tab and deploy API. We don't have any stages yet, so that will be a new stage. And I'm going to use test for the stage name. And now we'll deploy. It deploys immediately here, and you can see we have some default throttling already set up. Since this is going to be an endpoint anyone can access, we do have some automatic throttling so it doesn't get spammed. We also have an invoke URL. This is our unique address where our API sits. So with this all set up, we just want to test this now. We're going to run a few curl commands to do that. So if you have a bash terminal where you can run curl, you can use that. If you don't have one already available to you, you can use the Cloud Shell here, which is built into the console. So I'm going to click on that, which will set up our Cloud Shell session. If you haven't run this recently, it'll take a couple minutes for the environment to set up. So now that we have this shell up, we can test out our API. So I'm going to run this curl command. We're going to test the login function first. So if we remember, that's going to be of the method type post. So we'll use a dash capital X post to change the method there. And then we'll be passing in data with a dash D. We'll have to pass a JSON object with the username and password. Then we'll have to put our API URL. So that will be the invoke URL followed by /login and enter. If everything's set up correctly, you should see a status of success, and we have this tokens object which has a few different tokens here. We're going to be looking at the ID token here, and we're going to be using this for making an authenticated request to start session. Before that though, I'm going to run one more test on the login function just to make sure that with a bad password we get an expected result. As you can see here, we've got a status of fail and a message the username or password is incorrect. So the login functionality seems to be all up and working. Awesome. So let's now test the start session function. So we'll do that. We'll do curl -x get, and then to pass the authorization token, that will be a -H for header, and then we're using the authorization header to pass the token. So that will be authorization : bearer followed by that ID token. So that ID token we just got is going to be this last token in the list here. So I'll close quote there on the header, and then we'll put the endpoint, followed by a /start session. So once we click enter on that, you can see we have an object returned back with our player session ID. We can verify that this is the fleet we've created. We can see status is reserved and the IP address, which is where we have a game server where we can now connect. So with this, all of our backend is now set up. Everything seems to be working right. In the next episode, we're going to use this functionality in the Unreal client to actually make those connections to a game server. Stay tuned for the next episode.